Hello, I am Mabel Henrietta Peterson Herbst. Some of you may know my granddaughter, Christy Herbst. She's quite the Chautauqua County historian, and she wanted so much for me to be here tonight that she's put together a script so that I can tell you my story. In 1890, I was born in an area in far northern Minnesota, a beautiful part of the world. It was a great place to grow up. I had brothers and sisters to play with, a pony to ride to school, and the neighborhood kids were so much fun. As I approached the years when grown children begin to move on in life, I had one major goal: to make my own way in the world so as not to burden my parents. You see, I was the eldest of 6 children, so my parents had lots of mouths to feed. Of course, as a girl, I was expected to be married off so I'd have a husband to support me. But I sure wasn't ready for that. There was a whole world out there, and I wanted to see it. So, to be able to support myself, I took the only job I could find, becoming an assistant cook for a crew of itinerant farm workers who followed the wheat harvest. Starting in the Texas Panhandle in the spring, we'd then move north through the prairies, following the ripening crop, and finishing up in Minnesota in the fall. That was in 1908, and I was only 17. What an adventure! We traveled in horse-drawn wagons and camped on the outskirts of small towns. Our crews were hired by local farmers to help gather their grains with our fancy mule-drawn combine harvester. I loved that life. Seeing new places, meeting new people, and learning to cook for large groups, a skill I would use whenever I needed money throughout my life. Now, you parents out there, don't worry, I was safe. The cook was a kind older gentleman who promised my father he would take care of me, and he did. But best of all, during that time, I met the man I would marry when we were harvesting the wheat on his family's farm in southern Minnesota. Oh, I was smitten. Paul Frank Herbst was dark and handsome, and because he was a decade older than I, he seemed so worldly. Married within a year, Paul and I settled in a house he built on the farm. Along came 2 sons, Earl and Boyd, then our beloved daughter, named for my favorite sister, Lilas. I was happy living there on the farm with all of the others, until I wasn't. Being the youngest of the wives of 4 brothers wore pretty thin, I thought I would be trapped for the rest of my life. Paul knew what I was feeling. Looking back, I realize he too must have been chafing under the yoke of running a farm in partnership with his brothers. But he was in charge of the farm's horses, the working stock, as well as the side business of breeding and selling horses. So one year, he traveled to make a delivery to a farmer in Westfield, New York. He returned home raving about the appeal of this area, the beauty, the opportunities to farm or find other work. And so he packed up our family and we headed east. Thank God. By 1920, we were living on Hardenberg Road, where Paul farmed a small vineyard. Eventually, we settled in town, making our home over there at 60 Spring Street. We were so happy our first years here, which then were marred by the tragedy of our precious Lilas. Having contracted meningitis, this cheerful, affectionate child, this excellent student, died at the unthinkable age of 9. I can't describe our loss. You never get over losing a child. The first of us to be buried, you can find her round headstone over there close to the shed. Paul and I had one more child, Darwin. Eventually, the older boys married, starting their own families. We weathered the Great Depression. Then in 1942, Darwin graduated from high school and immediately went off to war. Happily, on his return from that conflict, he began his family. However, our calm soon was shattered when my Paul died. I was a widow at 57. Left on my own, I sold the house on Spring Street, instead renting a small apartment. Tying grapes in the spring and picking them in the fall I further supplemented my income by cooking in local restaurants. As the years passed and I realized I was aging, I wanted to take action to be sure I didn't become a burden to my boys, as there was still so much out there I wanted to see. I knew I could not travel the world, but I could travel our country. So I bought a Rand McNally Road Atlas and began planning my itinerary. The Greyhound bus agent and I worked out a 12-foot-long string of open-ended tickets, which eventually would take me to my destination, San Pedro, California. It was difficult leaving my boys and their families. I didn't expect to see them or my grandchildren again. I spent several years on the road, and what a trip I had. Oh, along the way, I spent quite a bit of time in Minnesota visiting my son Boyd and the scattered families of my sisters and brothers. Whenever I ran short of money, I'd take a job someplace as a short order cook. And so it went for the rest of the trip and for the rest of my life. I did stay close to my children and grandchildren through cards and letters, especially enjoying corresponding with my grandchildren. One time, my brother Kenneth and I collected pockets full of rocks from a California beach. I boxed them up and sent them to Darwin's girls, Diane, Christy, and Joan, who were living in Hartfield, New York. I just knew how excited those sisters would be receiving that touch of the Pacific Ocean. And they were. Wish I'd been able to know them as adults. So I lived out the rest of my life there in California. I did see Earl and Darwin one more time when they drove out west. Oh, what a wonderful few days we enjoyed together. Reminded of how much my family loved me and happily satisfied by my son's visit. I died soon after in the fall of 1964 at the age of 74. Oh, now that's enough about me. It's time for you to move on. By the way, I want to finish my highball and smoke my cools, so shoo, shoo.